In the spirit of, I'm going to slightly depart from the spirit of the discussion so far. And so while this book, which I've read twice now, and this time more seriously because I was supposed to engage with it here, one of the things that strikes me is that, like, if you go to Munirka or Rangpuri Pahari or let's say Shahpur Jat, you get a certain kind of an urban village. But once you go up north or towards the east, where there was industry at one time, which is like shut down now or reinvented itself, then you do find urban villages where there's a lot of home-based domestic production done by women, which is a whole different scenario. And so it's not about global versus local or anything, but possibly Delhi's urban villages have to offer many more kinds of social relations than the particular focus on Jat-dominated urban villages bring to the fore. So how would you like respond to that? Okay. Which brings me to the next question, which is, so for example, my colleague Ghazala Jamil's work on accumulation by segregation kind of brings a very different kind of, using more or less the same kind of method that you have, and it sort of also resonates in terms of not only method but also about conceptual frameworks, but throws up very different conclusions, let us say. There's also work by people who've worked on, let us say, Noida, where where also actually the urban has like converted villages into the urban, and so this thing about the rural-urban divide is very different. It plays out very differently there, but the same thing about being the owner of a non-reproducible property, which is land, is the main thing, and which is what Karl Marx said in 1944 about what is rent, that when you get something out of land which is non-reproducible property. That was his starting point on what is ground rent. Okay. Now, the second point, which is related, is in some way that, there's also something reverse in India that's happening, which is areas which were classified as urban are being reclassified as rural under neoliberalism because there are regulations because of environmental and other reasons in urban areas, and so capital is being given a freehold to go and settle in rural areas and set up factories, etc. So urban reclassified as rural. So that's not something that's actually part of the existing studies, either on rural studies or urban studies, and this is a gray zone. One needs to, what I'm saying is this critique of the dichotomy between rural and urban needs to also take into account these phenomena. Now I come to 2 or 3 conceptual questions which kind of resonate with what Dr. Kumar has said, but also there are certain departures. So your first, the second chapter rather, which looks at that's the first chapter, 1950s, and the second chapter is, so let me go chapter wise. So this question that is raised about why does the state leave out something and doesn't? So I would articulate it, as you said, you read my book, so you may know, as there are zones of intervention and non-intervention by the state, and this keeps changing depending on changing state-society relations and what are the paradigms within which the state needs to play out its policy and institutional role. So if we, one of the things I thought was missing is this is precisely the time, because you were talking about Vasantgaon and what was the other village you mentioned? Anyway, but Masoodpur, which still exists, but like it's depleted. But a large part of this area is actually built out of destruction of the ridge, which actually these villages were located in the ridge. So there is an environmental and ecological aspect also to the way in which this rentier economy is, the moral economy of rent and rent seeking, as well as the political economy is set up. Okay? Which I think would be interesting to explore if you want to push this further. And similarly, which reminded me that some of the questions that you are engaging with actually also informed a more theoretical debate, but based on empirical evidence, which was that precisely about the relationship between rent and capital. And it was something that was deeply engaged with Utsa Patnaik, and she had originally written a piece in the Journal of Peasant Studies in the early 1980s, but the work dates back to the 1970s. So when David Harvey is engaging with rent in a different sort of register, there is an engagement here which actually may provide a conceptual, I'm not saying that it answers everything, it's located in a particular thing, in a particular period, but it goes back to a certain formulation which in your introduction, you maybe unknowingly or knowingly reproduce, which is that classical political economy had this idea that rent is unproductive. Yes, Marx did, but Smith did, but Ricardo didn't. Okay, that's the first. But Marx, anyway, was never somebody who said that rent is unproductive. Marx was looking at the relationship between rent and capital. So it's different from how the classical political economists looked at it. And the main difference from classical political economy is that Marx looks at, and that is what resonates today, as the conversion of surplus labor and then continuation into surplus value, where rent is a part of the surplus value. Okay? And so, if you don't call it primitive but primary accumulation, then in his later writings you see how rent actually is one kind of capital accumulation, and how then that may not lead to actually what he calls capitalist accumulation. So, yeah. Now in our times, of course, the nature of, so you've also referred to Mushtaq Khan's work and Jomo, but Mushtaq's latest work, though it's in a slightly different kind of framework, his understanding of rent and rent seeking actually is closer to yours, in the sense that what he's doing is now what he did for Bangladesh and then what he did for India, and he's now looked at Indian states, he's looked at Indonesia, and like looking at a range of countries, and now scholars in the global north get funding so they can do this. So there is now looking at, through his students, Africa, Latin America, Europe, Palestine. He has an entire book on that, state formula, which is based on this idea of rent. So the idea that two things, I think, get challenged through the method that you've taken, but there's work that actually answers your question in a certain way or leads to a certain thing about looking at that how localized is this local. And it turns out that scholarship on or from both seem to point out that it is not as localized as it seems to be. Though I have a problem that this local-global binary, as he pointed out, that imperialism has really made us internalize all of this. Okay. Now, the main point with which I would like to conclude is that, well, 2 points really. The first is then the question of rentier capitalism and crony capitalism. So historically, even within what is formal political economy, which hasn't sort of become interdisciplinary enough and stuck to the thing about political power and economic power and looking in those terms. There is a certain conceptualization of how financialization has converted what you were referring to. So what Amazon is monopoly rent, these are standard categories, right? But that there is increasingly a shift to rent seeking and rent, but from that it doesn't mean that rent has nothing to do with capital, because if you go back to your colony, these people are then also, they're not just building floors. If they're building floors, that is real estate, that is construction and profit. If they are investing in the share market, that is another form of creation of capital. And so essentially rent and capital are not a binary, is what I would pose to you provocatively. And the last is really a question that bothered me, is that in the delineation of bhaichara and the cups, etc., what is the story of women and property in this entire narrative? Okay? Thank you so much.